Hello to everyone. It's great to have people here in person today, and also to everyone on Zoom as well. I'm delighted to give a warm welcome to Eugene and Martin, who are part of Positive Voices, a group within the Terrence Higgins Trust, who share their personal journeys as a way of dispelling the stigma and trauma around HIV. This event is part of the LGBTQ IEP Plus History Month, and Eugene and Martin go around organisations like ourselves to raise awareness of THT's bold mission of trying to eradicate HIV by 2030, which I think is amazing. We're going to donate as an organisation £5 to everyone that joins this event, either in person or on Zoom. So just by being here, you're contributing to this mission. I remember being petrified as a 15-year-old gay kid in the closet by seeing the government's campaign in 1986, which talked in very crude terms about the death sentence that having HIV would be. This campaign and the resultant loss of so many talented people had a seismic effect on how I approached being open about who I was. There was so much stigma, misinformation, rejection and shame in how society perceived the gay community during this time. It was organisations like the Terrence Higgins Trust, which was named after a young gay man who died of AIDS, that supported people through what was an incredibly traumatic time. From helping people kind of dealing with the illness to focusing on how to prevent it, and lastly, how to eradicate it. I could have never imagined that we'd be here now at the point in which we are, given the magnitude of the situation then. When I trained as a psychotherapist, it was important for me to pay back in some way. And THT was one of the first organizations that I wrote to. And thankfully, they accepted me in terms of a trainee psychotherapist. So I worked in the King's Cross branch for a year. And it was an incredibly rewarding experience to be part of the organisation and to kind of help people through some of the biggest challenges in their life. So I'm going to hand over to Eugene, who's going to take us through a deck which has an intro on THT.
Thanks very much. So my name is Eugene Lynch. I, as well as being a Positive Voices speaker, I'm the Senior Positive Voices Coordinator at the Terrence Higgins Trust. We're going to talk to you a bit about our organisation. After that beautiful introduction, there's not much more we need to say, but we're going to talk as well about HIV today in the UK and around the world, and talk about some of the statistics, but also what it's like living as a person with HIV today, and dealing with the stigma that's associated with HIV. And not that the slides aren't interesting, I find them very interesting, but you know, I'm a geek that way. But the really compelling part of the Positive Voices talk is personal stories. So Martin and I will share our personal stories of living with HIV as well. Martin, do you want to give a quick introduction?
I'm just another Positive Voices speaker, Martin. So I'm going to save my thunder for my story.
Fantastic. Okay, we're going to start off with a short video. This doesn't always work, so bear with us. But the video basically shows a bit of the history of the 40-year fight against HIV and against stigma. And it talks a bit about those 2030 goals that you already mentioned, of eradicating HIV transmission from person to person in the UK. And we can talk a bit about it afterwards. So that video kind of is a bit of a whistle-stop tour through 40 years, and it was put together by the HIV Commission, so the Terrence Higgins Trust, the National AIDS Trust, and the Elton John AIDS Foundation just over a year ago. And the reason for the HIV Commission was really to put pressure on the government to publish its HIV action plan, which would help us to get to the goal that they signed up to eradicate HIV transmission by 2030. In terms of the Terrence Higgins Trust, so as a charity, it was set up in 1982 during the AIDS crisis after the death of Terry Higgins, who's pictured on the right of the screen. He was one of the first people in the UK to die of an AIDS-related illness, and the Terrence Higgins Trust is now the largest HIV and sexual health charity in Europe. And our vision is quite straightforward: a world where people with HIV live healthy lives free of prejudice and discrimination, and good sexual health is a right and reality for all. In terms of HIV today, around the globe there are around 38 million people living with HIV, and in 2020 680,000 people died of an AIDS-related illness. Those deaths are preventable, and we can talk a bit about sort of how that works a bit later on. In the UK, in 2020 there were just under 107,000 people living with HIV, and of those about 5,000 were unaware of their HIV status. That number fortunately is going down, but we can talk about sort of how we get to the 2030 goals and what it all means a little bit later on. I know we have an international audience today, so we've added in some kind of international figures as well. About 1.2 million people are living with HIV in the US, and nearly 160,000 of those are unaware of their HIV status. In terms of HIV globally, and I can show you in a bit more detail, the burden of HIV falls disproportionately on the global south and on Eastern and Southern Africa in particular. So about 20.7 million people are living in Eastern and Southern Africa with HIV. And those who are most at risk of acquiring HIV today are women and girls aged 15 to 24 in Eastern and Southern Africa. In terms of the basics, so what is HIV, what is AIDS? There are different things and they shouldn't be used interchangeably. HIV is the human immunodeficiency virus. It is an infectious virus that attacks the immune system. We highlight the human part. If you are human, it is possible for you to get HIV if the conditions are right, and we'll talk about what those conditions are in a second. But don't forget there's a human, it's not just a disease, there's a human where that disease lives, essentially. And AIDS is acquired immune deficiency syndrome. It's when HIV goes untreated and the immune system is weakened over time. We tend not to talk about AIDS that much in the UK these days. We talk about a late diagnosis for HIV or late stage HIV, but AIDS and deaths from AIDS are quite rare in the UK. But as I said, globally, it is still something that happens all too frequently. I said that HIV can be transmitted to anyone if the conditions are right, and I volunteer on the THT Direct helpline. When people call us and they have questions about something that's happened, a risk that they might have taken, this is the framework that we use to help them work through whether or not that's a risk for HIV. So we talk about quantity, quality, and route. So in order for HIV to be passed from one person to another, HIV, first of all, needs to be present. That's not always obvious to people, but it needs to be present, and it needs to be present in a sufficient amount of bodily fluid. There are 5 bodily fluids that can contain HIV, and those are blood, semen, vaginal fluids, breast milk, and anal mucus. And then the other 2 are things that people sometimes get confused over. So the second one is quality. The virus has to be of good enough quality. There have to be enough viable copies of the virus in the fluid sample. HIV is not like other viruses. It's quite fragile. It doesn't survive well outside the body. And so for that reason, if you're dealing with a bodily fluid that generally has already left the body and come in contact with light, air, the wrong temperature, it generally breaks down very, very quickly. And the final thing is route. So the virus has to get from the bodily fluid of the person living with HIV into the bloodstream of the HIV negative person. And for that reason, for those reasons together, in the UK, the vast majority of HIV transmissions are from unprotected anal and vaginal sex. You can see, you probably can't see it very clearly, but this is the new diagnoses of HIV by probable route in the UK since 2015. And what you'll notice at the end is that heterosexual sex has overtaken sex between men as the primary route of transmission for the first time in 10 years. And that's based on the percentages. The number of diagnoses is going down in both cases, but it's actually going down faster in gay and bisexual men and other men who have sex with men. And part of the reason for that is people getting tested more regularly and the more wide availability and knowledge of PrEP among gay and bisexual men. So that's transmission of HIV. What about HIV prevention? We have 4 key tools in our toolbox to prevent HIV transmission. They are all the tools we need. People are talking about sort of new therapeutics and vaccines, and there are some exciting developments coming along the lines, but we have everything we need to end HIV transmission right now. Those are testing, treatment, condoms, and PrEP. I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail about testing, treatment, and PrEP, but just a quick word on condoms. They're very effective at preventing HIV transmission. They can also prevent pregnancy, and they're good against most other STIs. But we're going to go through the other ones in a little bit more detail. Testing for HIV has come a long way since the first tests became available in the 1980s. You get your result a lot quicker now than you used to. And also the window period from a risk taking place to a test being conclusive has shortened. There are various different ways you can access tests. If you're anywhere in the UK, you can go to the Terrence Higgins Trust website. There's a test finder, and you can find any test that's available to you, either free or paid. You don't need to pay for a test. You can get them for free pretty much anywhere. But in many areas, you can get a test posted to you that you can do at home, and you can also go into a GUM clinic. There are different types of tests. It's important to be aware of that. So if you have a test where you have blood taken from your arm and sent to the lab, that test will be conclusive after 45 days. So 45 days after a risk has taken place. If you have any kind of test where you prick your finger and you need to either give a sample of blood or you get a result straight away, like the one in the middle, those tests take 90 days to give you a completely conclusive result. But any of those types of tests will give you a really good indication in the first 28 days, or by 28 days. The second tool that we have in terms of HIV prevention, and this requires a little bit of explanation, is medication for people living with HIV. So HIV treatment doesn't cure HIV, but it stops the virus from reproducing in your body. I take one pill every morning with my breakfast. It has 3 components, and it does, what it does is it reduces the amount of HIV in your bloodstream to undetectable levels. That has 2 effects. First of all, it means you can have a normal life expectancy. So a man in his 30s diagnosed with HIV today, if it's diagnosed early, the life expectancy of that man will be 1 to 2 years longer than the general population. It's a little bit counterintuitive, but that's what the statistics tell us. If you get a late diagnosis, it's a little bit more complicated, but you can have a normal life expectancy as long as you're taking your medication. And an undetectable amount of HIV means that you can't pass HIV on to your sexual partners. If you remember one thing today, remember that fact. We go on about it as much as possible because more people need to know about it. People on effective HIV treatment cannot pass on the virus to their sexual partners. The fourth prevention tool we have is PrEP and also PEP. I'll talk about the differences between those. But PrEP is a pill that is taken by HIV-negative people who want to stay HIV-negative. There are a couple of different ways to take it depending on the type of sex that you have. But when taken correctly, it can effectively eliminate HIV risk from unprotected sex. It is a game changer in HIV prevention. And after a long campaign, it is now available for free on the NHS if you qualify for it. If you are outside of the UK, you can contact your local healthcare provider or visit iwantprepnow.co.uk and find out ways that you can buy PrEP, generic PrEP, cheaply online. So that's PrEP. It's pre-exposure prophylaxis. You take it before a risk takes place. The other thing to be aware of is PEP. PEP is post-exposure prophylaxis. So it's taken by HIV-negative people after a risk has taken place. So if you have a scenario where, for example, a condom breaks, or in cases of sexual assault, for example, you can go to, in the UK, a GUM clinic, or if they're closed, A&E, who are open 24/7, and they will prescribe you PEP if it's indicated in your case. There are only a few scenarios where they would actually dispense PEP because mostly the risk of HIV is quite low from most activities. It has to be accessed within 72 hours of a risk taking place, and ideally within 24. And you have to take those pills for 28 days after the risk has taken place, but it can eliminate HIV transmission risk. It's important to say that, we talked about it earlier, the H in HIV stands for human. If you're human, it is possible for you to contract HIV if the conditions are right. HIV can affect anyone. And we talk about sort of at-risk groups or groups with higher prevalence, but it can affect anyone. That's really important to remember. But inequalities mean that HIV affects some communities more than others. And on a global scale, we can kind of split this into a couple of different categories. So in Eastern, Southern, and West Africa, women and girls are most at risk. I mentioned that earlier. In the rest of the world, UNAIDS divides the world into key populations. And outside of Eastern, Southern, and Western Africa, sex workers and their clients, gay and bisexual men and other men who have sex with men, people who inject drugs, and trans people make up about 93% of HIV diagnoses. That number is much higher globally than it is in the UK, as we saw earlier on. Heterosexuals make up 50% of diagnoses in the UK, but globally, those are the key populations at risk. And then within countries, inequalities help to worsen the epidemic. So inequalities in terms of race, gender, gender-based violence, the criminalization of transmission of HIV, the criminalization of gay sex, the criminalization of drug use, the criminalization of sex work, all of these things actively work against HIV prevention and efforts to eradicate HIV. And other sort of things like poverty or lack of access to healthcare for groups and migration status and things like age discrimination can help to worsen the epidemic. I'm not going to go through sort of this information in any great detail, but the key thing to pull out of this, I mentioned it before, 4 in 5 HIV infections among 10 to 19-year-olds in sub-Saharan Africa are among girls. And around 44 girls aged 10 to 19 died of AIDS-related illnesses every day in 2018. So it kind of gives you a kind of an overview of where the burden of HIV is falling globally. And these deaths are entirely preventable if people get onto medication. Just a word on sort of the availability of medication globally. People have an assumption that is probably based on sort of 10 to 15 years ago that in Eastern and Southern Africa, HIV medication is not widely available. That's actually not the case. A lot of countries in Eastern and Southern Africa are doing really, really well and are doing better than Western European and North American countries in getting HIV medication to people. So, for example, Botswana was one of the first countries in the world to meet the UN's 2020 targets for elimination of HIV, along with the UK and Belgium, and pretty much no other country did. So you can kind of sometimes lazily assume that it's like a divide between sort of the global north and the global south, but actually a lot of the most innovative and effective HIV prevention and treatment initiatives are coming from Eastern and Southern Africa. And UNAIDS also says in terms of reaching its 2030 goals, which are to eradicate HIV deaths in particular, we need to focus on all of these inequalities, and we mentioned some of them already. If we focus on the virus and don't focus on the people and don't focus on the inequalities and the stigma, then we won't actually achieve the goal. In terms of the UK's specific goal, we're kind of planning to go one step further. We've mentioned it before, ending HIV transmission from person to person by 2030. The good news is that we're on track. UNAIDS set targets called the 1990-90 targets for 2020. The UK passed those back in 2017. There are targets for 2025, which are known as the 95-95-95 targets. I'm not going to go into great detail about what all this is, but the UK passed those the year before last. So we're in a situation now where we have fewer and fewer people that we need to find who are living with HIV and are undiagnosed. We need to get them onto treatment. But the problem that we've got is the more people we find, the harder it is to find the rest. Whereas efforts with gay and bisexual men and other men who have sex with men between sort of 2014 and now has led to a massive decrease in diagnoses, and those groups are a little bit easier to reach, and it's cheaper to reach those groups. The remaining people are going to be harder and harder to reach as that number kind of decreases. And we won't be able to do it unless we tackle the stigma associated with HIV and some of those inequalities that we talked about. If people fear living with HIV and they fear an HIV diagnosis, they're less likely to get a test. And we see that in places where normally opt-out testing should take place. So in sexual health clinics, there are people who will decline an HIV test when it's normally done and that is because they fear a diagnosis. Some of the issues that we talk about in our kind of personal stories and during the course of this presentation can be quite difficult. We've got a list of organisations available if you need any help and support on any of these issues. That's it in terms of slides. That's all I'm going to say, sort of bombarding you with slides. What we're going to do now is, and there's going to be plenty of time for questions at the end, but what we're going to do now is kind of talk to you a little bit more about our own personal stories and our personal experience. And I'm going to bring Martin in at this point because you're going to speak first, because we've had enough of me prattling on for a while.
All right. So I'm going to tell you a coming out story. It happens to be my coming out story because it makes it easier for me to follow. I was diagnosed in 2006. I was diagnosed late. And I know that, or how do you know that? Because when you are diagnosed, there are sort of two key indicators. One is the level of your CD4 count, which is the sort of one of the cells that the immune cells that is attacked by HIV, and that was down at about 95, and a sort of healthy person would have something in the range 700, 800 up to 1,000, something like that, much higher range. And also my viral load was I think it was like 250,000. So bearing in mind that undetectable is under 50. That's the limit of the testing. So I diagnosed late. So I would have been HIV positive. Who knows? It depends on the individual. It's very variable. Easily 5 years, if not maybe more, before that. So I guess the first question is, well, why did I diagnose late? And I guess there are 2 or 3 reasons, really. One, I think, is very common, and all this is obviously going back to 2006, but I think some of these things are still some of the reasons people diagnosed late today. One was fear of losing my job. At the time, I worked for a major GlaxoSmithKline, a major pharmaceutical company, and it was sort of based partly in Philadelphia, partly in the UK, and I was at a senior role with them in engineering, and I would have to travel between the two quite often, 4, 5, 6, 7 times a year. And many people in the company did, before Zoom and all these Teams and all the rest of it. And at the time, if you were HIV positive, you couldn't enter the US. So I was paranoid that if I got tested and then I was positive, then I wouldn't be able to enter the US, and then they'd say, well, you can't do your job because half your employees are in the US or whatever. So I'd sort of, I think that could have been the case. The HIV wasn't a protected characteristic then. So I couldn't, in my head, I couldn't do my job if I was positive. So I didn't get tested. Probably ignorance of where the drug treatments were at that time, because I grew up at an age when the epidemic sort of broke. And there was no treatment, and people were dying from the disease, and therefore, I suppose ignorance of, there was a sort of view, I think, that almost the treatments were almost worse than having the disease, and that sort of having that view, which was incorrect, I think again stopped me getting tested, and then just the whole thing, if I was then positive, everybody's going to reject me, and I think, don't forget, this is a time when if people were HIV positive, other gay people would sort of keep away from them. I guess, sexually, other HIV people would have sex with other HIV people, and the risk of transmission and all the rest of it. So it sort of put you into a subgroup within a subgroup. So, so those were, I think, some of the reasons I diagnosed late, and maybe some of the reasons people do today and don't go and get tested. obviously the test took like 2 weeks to come back and all of that, adding all those things into it. So I didn't do that. So there we are. I'm now HIV positive. So what do? Well, I do what lots of people do, which is I don't tell anybody for 9 years. Okay. So I now live with this secret for the next 9 years. And I think that is very common. People, when they get diagnosed, tell nobody outside of their healthcare professionals, or very few limited numbers of people. It obviously depends whether they've got partners and their circumstances. So, although it seemed a very extreme reaction, that's what I did. So that's why I'm telling you my story. I mean, I'm pretty crap at the coming out game. I didn't come out as gay until I was 27. I wasn't sexually active until I was 27. All my younger friends think that's hilarious. Can't understand that. But so, you know, I'm not very good at dealing with these issues, obviously, it seems. So, okay, so what then happens? So I continue with my job, I continue and I progress, and during that time, I did a couple of clinical trials as well. And just to sort of maybe accentuate the absurdity of the situation. So as I said, I work for GlaxoSmithKline through its ViiV subsidiary, is one of the main producers of antiretroviral treatment, the treatment for people living with HIV. And I was senior in engineering. And I would then go to our factories, and I would oversee our major new introduction factories, the investment of capital, the extension of the factories to bring on new capacity and that they were run properly. So I'd be sitting in meetings reviewing a project to produce more capacity of the drug which I was taking. So I'm in the room saying, oh yes, is it on track, is it on time, all the rest of it. And you can't even say, oh, I'm taking that drug, or and I've got a bottle of it in my briefcase next to me. And you know, you do all the stuff where when you travel overseas, some countries it's illegal if you enter and they find it's the treatment in your bag, etc. So you have to sort of hide it in vitamin tablet bottles and throw the vitamins out and put them in, you know. So all of that sort of nonsense went on. So that's when. So just to try to express the absurdity of the situation. And then what happened? I was having other problems in my social life and just generally. And the job I was doing was really too big. I was covering the engineering for the pharma for the globe. So I was off to all over the place, traveling a huge amount. And it all just got to me. I wasn't performing. My boss at the time was a hard taskmaster, and I just wasn't really, I wasn't satisfying him, and probably it was too big a job. Anyway, it's just like all these things. It's never planned, right? So one evening he's working late, I'm working late in the office, and then he took me to task on something, and therefore. I lost my. It just all came out, and shouted at him, and I sort of said it all became, So I just said I got this problem, I've got that problem, I'm HIV positive, and all comes out like this. You see, so. And I think this tends to happen if you think back to your lives when you are under huge stress and you get to a point when it builds up to a point. This is no plan, and then it comes out. So actually, that was the beginning of my coming out, really. He was very good. He stopped his email. We went into an office and we really talked through it all. And I think there's something in that when somebody comes out in that sort of situation with news like that, almost treating it is without getting too emotional. And and that sort of worked for us. And then in the end, we decided to split the job. I mean, it's a big corporation, so it took 6 months, even though I was in it, to make these changes. And so that was the beginning. So I told my boss at work, basically, through just sort of losing it. And then it sort of moved on. And then I told one or two other people, trusted colleagues at work. And it gradually built up. And then I told the leadership team that I was part of. So again, I came out to them at one of our meetings. And so there's a picture here of building up to sort of telling people. And where this ended up was back, I think it was in 2018, I gave a presentation to our manufacturing site in Hertfordshire, where they made the drugs that I was taking. And so I think we had about 150 people in the room. So I worked with the site director there, who were one of the people I had told about my status. And so I did a presentation, as you can imagine, 150 people in the room. They stopped the production line, and the people that were running the lines that produced the products that I was taking, people from the offices, the management team. So I go and then I stand up in front of all these people, some of whom had worked for me, some of I'd worked with, and so I did this took through the whole story, but it was explaining what HIV was, how the drugs worked, how the drugs they produced, how they affected, and the side effects, and the fact I'd been on clinical trials, one of which was for that product, all without anybody knowing, even though I was working for that same company. And I suppose it was quite an emotional thing, really. So there was all these people, it was double whammy. Some of them were finding out I was gay at the same time. I don't know how they missed that. But anyway, it was sort of, I joined the ERG group after that at GSK. It's called Spectrum, and I was VP of engineering at the time, and I joined, and I think it was about 4 months. Everybody thought I was an ally. I don't know why, but I think it was just because of the seniority of joining it. But anyway, that's an aside. We'll get back to the HIV. So where that then led to was I gave a series of 20 presentations all around the globe, talking to our manufacturing sites where they made HIV products, to explain to them how the drugs worked, how they stopped the multiplication of the virus, the effects on me personally, the sort of the elements of stigma, etc., explaining to people that normal life expectancy with modern day treatment. So that was the thing that most people found astounding, followed by what we call U equals U, undetectable equals untransmittable. In other words, even with unsafe sex, you can't pass the virus on if you are ineffective at treatment and you have an undetectable viral load. So this is where we went to. So I went from in the closet to giving 20 of these talks all around the world. And so I became, in the end, it was Martin, the engineer, the patient, the advocate. So I went from being in the closet to being an intranet star. So in the end, I ended up coming out to 110,000 employees through the intranet and through my talks, etc. And that's my coming out story. And I guess that the sort of thing I want to sort of pull out from that is that we need to get to a place where being HIV positive and living with HIV is straightforward, that people, when appropriately, talk about it. And it's a little bit now, and I know it's still difficult for people to go through discovering their sexuality and all the rest of it, but it's accepted in countries like the UK or other Western European countries that you know, it's okay to be gay, and it's just an accepted part of life. And it's not being HIV positive at the moment, and we need to just get to that point where it is the same and it becomes a matter of fact. In the same way, other people now talk about much more so their mental health, they talk about living with cancer, you know, so people talk much more openly about chronic conditions that they have. And so that's where we need to get to, that it doesn't take 9 years, and it doesn't take the resources of a multinational pharmaceutical company and their 110,000 employees to get you there. So that's really where we need to get to. So I shall stop there.
Thank you, Martin. As I mentioned, we'll have time for kind of Q&A at the end. Yeah, thank you for sharing all of that. And I'm gonna attempt to be as erudite in sharing my story. So I'm going to take you back to 2013. I, at that point, had been living in London for 9 years. I moved to London in 2004 after finishing university, started a job as a management consultant with Deloitte, not far from here. Yeah, life was pretty good, things were going well. I was 9 years in that job, and I was with my partner Tim in a monogamous relationship for 6 years at that time. And if you can picture the scene, I was on a rooftop in East London, sitting in a hot tub with a group of friends, watching a movie at Hot Tub Cinema. So like there were lots of hot tubs on this rooftop, and there's like a big screen, and everyone's like in their little groups in hot tubs watching a movie. It was a fun event, terrible movie, but really fun event. And but it was, even though it was August in London, it was quite cold, and I was getting in and out of the hot tub quite a bit, and it was kind of chilly. And the next morning I wasn't feeling great. The drink might have had something to do with that as well. But I wasn't feeling great the next day, and over the course of the next 2 or 3 days, things deteriorated a little bit. And I kind of thought, well, this isn't cold or flu. I had a rash, and I had pain down one side of my body, and I thought, that's not normal, I should go and see my GP. I made an appointment, went in to see my GP. She took one look at me and said, "You've got shingles." And I went, well, that's weird. I turned 30 the previous month, and I had chickenpox when I was a child, and it's the same virus. So I kind of thought, that's a bit weird. She made a similar calculation, and she said, okay, we're just going to send off for some additional tests. And I had a few things in my favor. I had a good relationship with that GP in that she knew I was a gay man, I was living with my partner, and she was originally from South Africa, which has the highest HIV prevalence rate in the world. So one of the things she did was send off for an HIV test. A couple of days later, I got a phone call. I was back at work. They'd given me antivirals, and I'd started to recover. And a couple of days later, I got a phone call from the receptionist at the GP's office, and they said, can you come in at the end of the day? The GP wants to speak to you. And I thought, oh, this is not going to be good news. They don't bring you in at the end of the day for good news. And I walked into the GP surgery through the waiting room, and it was completely empty. And I'd never been in that waiting room when it was empty before. I was like, this is weird. And they ushered me straight into the GP's office. And she sat me down, and she said, your HIV test has come back reactive. And so I was just in complete shock. The whole world sort of stopped. And I don't really remember a lot of what happened after that. I had a slightly out-of-body experience. Not much of what she was saying was really going in. But about a half an hour later, I left that office, and I remembered two things. One was that I had a test the next morning at St. Mary's Hospital for confirmation, and that I could bring my partner with me to get him tested. I don't remember how I got home, but when the initial shock started to wear off, it was replaced with fear. My first big fear was, I've got to tell my partner. We've been together 6 years, and what if I put him at risk? And what if he's positive as well? So I waited for him to come home. Just being the kind of person I was, I just feared rejection the entire time. The entire time we were together, I feared rejection, but particularly because of this, I was like, he's going to reject me, he's going to leave me straight away. He got home from work, and I sort of burst into tears, and I told him the news. And I said, will you come with me tomorrow morning to get tested? And he said yes, and he gave me a hug, and he said it was going to be okay. So the next morning, we went to the hospital. Again, I don't remember much of what happened, but they took blood from both of us, and the test results came back really quickly, which isn't normal. You normally have to wait a little while. And they said that my test was positive and his test was negative. So that was my first relief. I was like, okay, so I haven't passed HIV on to him. I don't have that guilt. But then I had more fear. I was like, how am I going to explain this? I'd had a negative HIV test 3 years before, and we'd been in a monogamous relationship for 6 years. So I was filled with fear. I was filled with a lot of shame. And I was kind of like, how could I have brought this into our relationship? We didn't really talk much about it. I didn't tell anyone else for a couple of years, similar to Martin. I told my best friend after a couple of years, partly because I thought I probably should. Tim and I were living with my best friend from college. He was our flatmate, and I thought he's going to see my medication and maybe ask questions. So I kind of told him out of necessity, and he reacted really well. But I didn't really talk about HIV. And when a few weeks after my diagnosis, when Tim said to me, "How do you think you got this?" I sort of mumbled some sort of excuse about we'd been taking recreational drugs at the weekends, and I said I thought maybe when I was sharing a banknote while using cocaine, I might have got it that way. He didn't quite believe that, but we sort of moved on. And spoiler alert, you can't get HIV that way, just in case you were wondering. You can potentially get hepatitis C that way. It'd be very unusual, but you can't get HIV that way. Anyway, I was just like, I just want to take my pills, move on with my life, not tell anyone, especially not tell anyone in work. I don't want anyone in work to find out about this. I didn't really realize why that was going through my head at the time. It took until much later to work out how much shame I was dealing with. Despite all my efforts to get on with my life started to fall apart, basically. But over the course of the next 5 years, my mental health deteriorated. I was already quite an anxious person. I had a lot of anxiety. Didn't really realize it at the time. I thought everyone felt that anxious all the time. But it got worse and worse. And it got to the point in 2018 where I was having panic attacks every morning. I wasn't able to go to work. I wasn't able to leave the house without having a panic attack. And I had this fear going into the office that if people saw me and thought I looked ill, they'd start asking questions, and I didn't want to be asked questions. So that was where I was. I feared the question, I feared that I would have to tell them eventually, like through occupational health or whatever else, that I had HIV, and then I feared what questions they'd ask me about where I got it, or stuff like that. And those were questions I didn't want to answer. And I, at the time, although since I was a teenager, I'd always considered myself an out, proud gay man, and I was always out at work. I realize now, looking back, that I was editing myself, and I was trying to blend into the background as much as possible. I didn't want to stand out, and I wanted people to think I was really normal. So I even dressed like really boring. And I realized, looking back, that that came from a place of shame, and it came from a place of internalized homophobia, and that I was hiding who I was as much as I could at work while still pretending to be proud. And I thought that if I told anyone about my HIV, they would make loads of assumptions about my lifestyle or the kind of person I was. Not being able to go to work and all of that, I was seeing occupational health. I went to my GP and got help for the anxiety, but I didn't tell any of those people about the amount of alcohol and drugs I was taking to try and deal with all of the anxiety. Now, it's not a good idea to self-medicate. I wouldn't recommend it to anyone, but if you're going to self-medicate for anxiety, don't use cocaine. It's a really bad idea. That's what I was doing. It's also a very expensive idea, but I was spending £300 a day on cocaine. I was drinking a bottle of vodka every day, and then I was really anxious all the time, and I didn't really know why. Probably should have worked it out. But that's where I was, and I didn't want to tell my GP, I didn't want to tell occupational health, because I thought, if they know I'm taking drugs, they're just going to fire me. It'll be a really good excuse. So I was a bit stuck, and I was on anti-anxiety medication, but it wasn't really helping because I wasn't being honest about the drugs. So I reached out to the Terrence Higgins Trust. I knew they had counselling for people living with HIV, and I thought if I get counselling through a charity, one, I won't have to, it's an HIV charity, I won't have to talk about what HIV is like or explain anything about HIV because they'll already know. And two, I'm accessing this kind of myself, and I can be a bit more honest about what's really going on for me. So I had a counsellor. We did it over Skype. This was back pre-COVID, so it was like I didn't have to leave the house, which was great because I was, I was at risk of having a panic attack, and I was able to get honest, at least a little bit honest. I wasn't fully honest at that time, but I kind of said, I'm taking a lot of drugs, and that was a bit of a relief. And I had a series of fortunate events happen after that, partly thanks to my partner Tim, who stuck with me through all of this, who had a couple of years earlier put me on his medical insurance, which I didn't know about, and I managed to get into to see a psychiatrist and to get into a residential rehab facility for 28 days. And that was where my life really started to turn around. I was sitting in a room full of people. I told them I had HIV. They didn't reject me like I expected them to. And I told them I was a drug addict, and I told them lots of things about myself, including answering the question that I'd been fearing this whole time, which was where I thought I got HIV. And this is the hard part. The truth is, I was raped back in 2012. Still difficult to talk about. And I didn't tell anyone for 6 years. And there's lots of different reasons why, but I blamed myself the entire time. And I felt a lot of shame about it. And I thought if I was really honest about exactly what happened, that people would reject me and they'd tell me it was my fault. And and so when I said it, when I kind of explained exactly what had happened, people responded with compassion and love and support, and they didn't reject me. And I kind of thought, well, maybe I've been looking at this the whole way, the wrong way the whole time. And really, that was the start of the turnaround. I had that kind of burden that I'd been carrying lifted off my shoulders, and a lot of help, a lot of therapy, a lot of recovery meetings, and a sponsor, and all of that kind of stuff. Later, I'm sitting here 3.5 years sober. I'm able to talk about this stuff. It's not always easy, but I'm not living in shame and fear my entire life. And so, I'm really grateful for this opportunity to be able to kind of share that experience. And if I can leave you with one thought, it would be about self-medication. It doesn't have to be dramatic. It doesn't have to be a bottle of vodka every day. In the past, the ways that I would self-medicate were overeating, or binging and purging, or compulsive shopping. I did for a while after I stopped alcohol and drugs, because your addiction comes out in weird ways. And think about what ways you might be self-medicating in your own life, and whether you could reach out for help and ask someone for help instead. That's what I'll leave you with. Thank you. I'm not sure how we're doing for time, but oh, excellent. Feel free to ask any questions you like. There's no good or bad questions.
Does anyone have any questions?
I've got plenty on the Zoom here. If not, thank you both so much for that. I've got lots of positive and moving feedback coming here on the Zoom. One question here we have is, you both share your personal stories so well and generously, so thank you. Do you find it challenging, and what really motivates you to give these talks that you've just so eloquently delivered today?
Have a shot at that. I mean, what motivates me really is to just explain the world of HIV to people where, cause it's sort of dropped out of the mainstream for obvious reasons, in that there's effective medication, so I like to do these because it just reminds people it's there, and then we still have some way to go to address the stigma. It's still a global issue, as you've seen from the slides. And even though we only sort of capture tens of people at a time with these talks, I still think it's worthwhile doing. So that's my motivation.
Yeah, I think very similar. We get lots of really great feedback from people when we give these talks. A lot of people, they've never had to think about HIV. They don't know some of the basics, and so being able to kind of educate people is a real privilege. And one thing that when I got out of rehab in 2018, I decided since the Terrence Higgins Trust had helped me, I'd find a way to give back. And so I started volunteering on the helpline later in 2018. I've been doing that for about 3 years, and I found it a really, really rewarding experience, and it taught me a lot about myself. And that gave me a lot of motivations. One of the reasons that I decided to become a Positive Voices speaker was, I was able to find my voice a little bit, build my confidence a little bit by talking to people who were in distress or in need or were worried. And when we get calls on our helpline, there's about 25% of them are from people living with HIV who have a problem that we might be able to help them with. Those calls can be really, really rewarding, and they're kind of like the bread and butter of what we do. But most of our calls are from people who are worried about transmission risk or about STIs. And some of those calls are from people who are really, really anxious because they don't know the facts, or they have a lot of shame around sex, or they're living in fear. And I really kind of identify with that, and I'm able to kind of give advice from a place of like lived experience as well, and I find that really rewarding.
Thank you. I've got another question here from Mark Mills. I was diagnosed HIV positive in November 2021, and I started my treatment in January 2022. My question is this: what advice would you give to people who are looking to support someone living with HIV? Have you got any tips, do's and don'ts, the best approach to those who are living, the best approach to supporting those who are living with HIV, specifically him at the moment, so they know they're getting it right? People care so much, and it's good they also get good advice as well.
Wow. Well, first I say thank you for sharing that, because that's not an easy thing to do. As we've discussed, it took us years to share with anyone. So thank you for sharing. I would say for anyone who's talking to someone who might tell them that they're living with HIV, just listen. Listen to what the person is saying. Reflect back that person's language. That's really important. We have some kind of tips of what language to use and that sort of thing. When we talk in our presentations, we always talk about people living with HIV. We always put the person first. We use person first language. That's quite a useful rule of thumb, to think about the person and not about the virus. But in terms of sort of advice for an individual, all I can say is finding other people living with HIV and asking for help around things like mental health. The sooner you can do that, the better, particularly if you need that support, if you don't have a support network. It sounds so weird when I say it now, but when I was diagnosed, I had a friend who was living with HIV, and I knew he was living with HIV, and I didn't tell him for 5 years about my status. And I don't know why that is. It's really strange. But we have a great relationship now, and we talk about, he's a doctor now. We talk about this sort of thing all the time. He's worked in sexual health for a while, so we have lots of stories to share about various things. But having other people who are going through what you're going through can be really, really helpful. I think when I was first diagnosed, I was offered peer support, and I said, no way, I'm not doing anything like that. I don't want to sit with with those people. And if I had done that, I think my life would have been completely different, because I think it would have been really, really helpful. I don't know if Martin, you've got any advice.
Yeah, I think, it's great that somebody who's so newly diagnosed is feeling that they can, talk about it in this sort of semi-open forum, I guess. So that's great. So maybe, we don't have to all wait 9 years, and it's my problem. So I think that's really nice for me. Don't ask the person how they got it. That's not a good thing to do. and that's a sort of a big no-no. And I guess I've had, when I've sort of by the by come out about my status, people sort of break down, start crying and all of that sort of stuff, which I don't think's, I mean, maybe it's genuine, I'm not saying it's not genuine, but I think it's from a misplaced view, oh, you're all going to die sort of thing, and sort of live a terrible life. So I think, however emotional that is, as Eugene says, listen, that person is putting trust in you to talk to you. They've unless it's, you know, like me, like the pressure cooker and it sort of boils over. But let's assume they're coming to talk to you because they feel safe doing that. So, you know, those are the sort of tips I would give, really.
Thank you both, and thank you, Mark. There's a lot of love coming through for you here, and just I think I speak on behalf of everyone when I say that all of our families here for you, and you're super brave. So thank you. Another question we have here is someone wants to know if you find any strength in spiritual beliefs.
No, not for me.
No.
Should we want to go next?
I could give a very long answer to this question. So I've got a chip on my shoulder about religion. Growing up Catholic in Ireland, going to Catholic school, I was an altar boy until I was like 16. And when I went to university, I was like 17 when I went to university, and I sort of immediately rejected all of that and became like what I would describe as a militant atheist, like evangelical about atheism. So I've had to work through separating the religion of my childhood from the idea of spirituality. So I do 12-step recovery. I go to like meetings all the time. I'm in like Narcotics Anonymous. Probably not supposed to say that because it's anonymous, but anyway. They talk about in that, and it's based on AA and stuff like that. They talk about, you know, the need for, you know, spiritual healing in your life and stuff like that. And I've learned a lot, and I've become a bit more open-minded about that stuff by going through that process. So, you know, I have things that I do that are kind of spiritual in nature. So I do things like meditation and yoga, and you know, even though I don't believe in a God, I do, you know, at the end of my meetings every week, stand around and pray with people because it's what you're supposed to do. And so I'm kind of finding my way with that. And I certainly find the meditation very, very useful. So if that counts as spirituality, that's something I find useful.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much. Oh, Vita's got a question here. Sorry, I should have addressed the room. I'm sure you do have questions now. Oh goodness, let me pass along to VJ here.
Thank you. Both of you spoke about how you were like covering or shielding the fact that you had HIV, and I think a lot of other people go through that in terms of like sexual orientation, gender identity, hidden disabilities, all that kind of thing. And you've both worked in quite big organizations. Is there anything you can say prevented you from speaking about either being gay or being HIV positive, working in those organizations, or anything about the culture or the people that you worked with, or anything that might have impacted your decision to not talk about those things?
I could probably, I can give an answer to that. So last World AIDS Day, so World AIDS Day is 1st of December, I went back and spoke to my previous employer in a Positive Voices talk, and they asked me this question. And I knew it was going to come, so I had an answer prepared. But I think the thing for me, there would be two things that would have made a huge difference. One was if I'd ever heard anyone talking about any stuff like that quite openly, particularly HIV. And the second would be if anybody had ever kind of talked about, because we had a huge thing for several years at the end of my employment there around mental health, and that was great. Like, people were talking more openly about mental health. It was a thing that was on the agenda. But nobody ever talked about drugs. And I'm definitely not the only person who was taking drugs in that organization. But there was another person from the organization in my rehab, so at the same time as me. So, you know, it was something that everybody ignored as a topic. Everyone pretended didn't happen. And I think that kind of stigmatization meant that, because my fear was, if I talk about my HIV, I'm going to have to talk about everything. And if I talk about everything, then I'll be completely ostracized or fired. So it's just making those kinds of things easier to talk about, I think would have made a huge difference. And there was an element of the culture that was a bit, because it was a partnership, and you know, in those days, the vast majority of partners were men, and they had it was a bit of a boys' club, and that was really unattractive to me. The best managers I had were all women. Sorry, guys. And the partners I'd enjoyed working for were all women. But there just weren't enough of them. And I found the kind of more male-dominated culture quite difficult to operate in. And now, you know, you're talking about kind of sexuality and gender identity. I'm on a bit of a journey at the moment. Like, I've been discovering myself over the last few years and kind of being comfortable with who I am and stuff like that. And just in the last 2 weeks, I've changed my preferred pronouns. I'm now going by he and they. I'm identifying as non-binary, although I have this whole thing in my head that, like, I've spent 38 years being bad at being a man, and now I'm going to be bad at being non-binary, which is the way I described it to my partner. And he was like, "You're just not going to win, are you? You're just setting yourself up for failure." And again, he didn't reject me. He was just like, you know, go easy on yourself. So yeah, I mean, I don't know why I threw that in at the end, but I was going to say it in my talk, but I forgot. But it's something I'm working through at the moment. I still haven't figured out, but I kind of feel like I've got the space to do it now. And you know, and I work in an environment that's quite nurturing to that. I mean, HIV charity is a good place to be working these things out. But yeah, I mean, the more open people can feel like they can be in a corporate workplace or an environment, I think the better. The more easy it is for people to bring their whole self to work and not to edit who they are or who they're trying to appear as. Because I watched, it was a TED talk actually by an Irish drag queen, and she was talking about actually a hate crime that happened, being somebody threw a carton of milk from a car and shouted some homophobic abuse. And it started this whole conversation about, like, what was it that gave the gay away? And so I'd recommend the TED Talk, definitely. But it was talking about being out in public and editing yourself and trying to, like, play things down. And I realized through watching that and through the work that I've been doing in therapy and various different things, that I had been doing that for, 15, 20 years. I was a wallflower. I was trying to blend into the background. And I didn't want anyone to, although everybody in my work knew I was gay, and I never kept it a secret, I tried my best not to seem that way, looking back on it. And if I could do it again, I would do it differently, I think.
Brilliant, thank you. Have we got any more questions in the room before I take any more from the chat? No? Okay. So, Martin, you mentioned that you were part of an ERG at GSK. Have you got any tips for what our LGBTQ plus ERG can do to help in this space?
I think, well, I guess the ERGs in general, to have sponsorship from senior people within the organisation, it was key for us. And I guess it sort of, when I started, I was sort of working in parallel because I started doing the talks about living with HIV, and but also became very active in the ERG, which was just really getting going. The company had only just really got behind the resource groups. And I think initially I found it quite difficult, to talk about. I felt if talking about living with HIV, will people, because the whole thing about ERGs, you're talking to maybe people not really familiar with gay culture or whatever it might be. So, then does it just too easy? So, all gay men are HIV positive, sort of link. So I think initially for me, that I was probably more worried by that link than I had need be really. Yeah, I think making that, but not making it. I think I'm trying to sort of almost minimise being HIV as being unremarkable. So it's a double-edged sword. You need to sort of publicise it, but on the other hand, you don't want to sort of hog the limelight, and it's a part of certain groups, high-risk groups' lives, but it's not the dominating feature. So I think it's that support, but just getting it in balance, really. And there's trying to be almost unremarkable. But to get to being unremarkable, you've got to publicise it so people understand, really. So it's...
Brilliant, thank you very much. I think that's really all we have time for today in terms of questions. I'm just going to hand back over to Luke, and he's going to wrap us up here.
I just wanted to say a massive, heartfelt thank you for sharing your stories. That was really inspirational and just amazing to just get your congruence in terms of the journeys that you've taken and where you are now today. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. And I just wanted to say to everyone that if you do want to get involved with RERG, that Ty Gordon and also Ross Hawke, who's part of the SLT, please just get in contact with those guys. Yeah, thank you again.
Well, thanks for having a face-to-face or a hybrid meeting, because I don't know, talking for myself, but also for Eugene, when you're talking to an audience, it's a very different feel to when you're sort of stuck in your dining room looking at the screen, because it's a sort of an emotional thing, there's a sort of connection, and obviously not everybody can be here physically. But I think it sets the scene by having a reasonably sized audience, and hopefully that comes across to people on the virtual link, that it has more to it because of that. So maybe we'll see more and more companies now going back to doing some face-to-face or hybrid meetings, because it makes, I think, as a speaker, it's much more fulfilling, and hopefully as a listener, a much more fulfilling experience.
Sorry, I've got one more question.
Oh, okay.
And I would like an answer for it. We've got Teresa here asking, what company benefits would have made a difference in your life navigating living with HIV? I think that's quite relevant for us and would be very useful to hear from you guys.
I guess I'm just trying to think. A lot of big companies have medical schemes, and one would imagine that whether you're HIV positive or not shouldn't make any difference, because that's. But I remember at GSK there was an issue in that quite often things follow the sort of modern medication, and the fact that really you're not at greater risk of having a hip operation or whatever it might be, that takes time for the sort of the medical status quo to filter through into the Bupa program or whatever that your company signs up with. But I would to imagine today, most companies would just take it as an existing chronic condition, as they would do for any other chronic condition when people sign up to medical schemes or whatever. Obviously now it's a protected characteristic, I think I'm right in saying, isn't it? So it's you can't discriminate on behalf if someone's HIV, which it wasn't when I first came out. So things have moved on this is in a UK context. You probably know more about that than me.
It's protected in the Equality Act 2010. So under the umbrella of disability, there's obviously all different types of disabilities are protected in that, but HIV, cancer, and MS are specifically mentioned as 3 things that are protected under law. And it's slightly complicated in terms of whether the employee has to disclose to you or not their status for them to be protected. That's a slight grey area, and other people will know better than me about that. Yeah, a lot of employers don't know that. So it's something that to be aware of. But in terms of sort of company benefits, yeah, I mean, the insurance thing is interesting. I opted out of my employer private medical insurance. You had to kind of opt in and then pay, and I didn't want to pay. And then my partner put me on his insurance and forgot to tell me, I think. So he was paying for me for a couple of years. That's the only reason I got into rehab. But yeah, I'm very fortunate. Yeah, I think with those kinds of pre-existing conditions and some exemptions and stuff, you do get it in some things like travel insurance. Even now, if you disclose your HIV status, they can sometimes charge you more for travel insurance. And there are lots of, it depends on the underwriter, I think, but there are lots of underwriters that they ask you what your viral load is, what your CD4 count is, and if they're below a certain amount, they don't charge you any extra. And that's really the way it should be, because you're not any bigger risk, as long as you don't forget your medication or something, like when you're taking it abroad. One thing to note, and you kind of touched on it as well, with the situation in the US as it used to be, there are certain places that you can't travel with HIV legally, and there are certain places that you can't travel with HIV medication. And when I was in my previous job, at one point they were trying to post me to Singapore, and I was like, I can't go to Singapore, and I didn't want to tell them why. But I was like, I'm just not allowed to go to Singapore. So, and they were like, oh, okay, fine. But yeah, and the reason was, if they found my HIV medication, they would deport me. And there are several places like that. Although fewer and fewer now, fortunately. I went in 2015, my partner and I and a friend of ours took time off, and one of the places we went was China, and that used to be somewhere that you couldn't go if you were living with HIV or if you had HIV medication, but it's not anymore.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, that's actually all we have time for now. This has been so informative. Thank you both so much. Thank you, Luke, for also speaking just wonderfully at the start. And hopefully we'll see you again, and we can start to do more of this in person, and just continue towards that mission of eliminating transmission by 2030. So thank you.
Thank you very much.